Welcome to the Scientific Sense podcast, where we explore emerging ideas from science, policy, economics, and technology. My name is Gil Epen. We talk with world's leading academics and experts about their recent research or general areas of topical interest. Scientific Sense is an unstructured conversation with no agenda or preparation. We cover a wide variety of domains where new discoveries are made and new technologies are developed on a daily basis. We are most interested in how new ideas affect society and help educate the world how to pursue a rewarding and enjoyable life rooted in science, logic, and information. We seek knowledge without boundaries or constraints and provide unedited content of conversations with researchers and leaders who love what they do. A companion blog to this podcast can be found at scientificsense.com, and this podcast is available on over a dozen platforms and directly at scientificsense.net. If you have suggestions for topics, guests, and other ideas, please send them to info@scientificsense.com, and I can be reached at gil@epen.info. My guest today is Professor Petra Schmid, who is Assistant Professor of Organizational Behavior at ETH Zurich. Her research examines the psychological and neural mechanisms involved in the effect of social power on behavior. Welcome, Petra.
Hi, Gil. Nice to meet you.
Yeah, so thanks for doing this. I want to start with one of your older papers from 2015, Power Effects on Cognitive Control, Turning Conflict into Action, in which you say power is known to promote effective goal pursuit, especially when it requires one to overcome distractions or bias. You said you propose that this effect involves the ability to engage and implement cognitive control. So before we get into the details of this, Petra, so what exactly do you mean by power? Is it sort of a perception of power, or is it something real?
Well, I would say it's something real, but it is, a psychological property. So I don't necessarily think about power as a specific rank, but it's more how powerful you feel, because there's been research showing that how powerful you feel affects your behavior and your decision making. It's less about the rank that you have. Sometimes people feel powerful when they have a higher rank, but this is not always the case. So here I'm really focusing on this mindset of power, this psychological experience of being powerful.
Yeah, so the mindset of power. So in an organizational context, power could come from titles, but it could also come from sort of networks in the organization, right? If you're at the center of a network, you may not have the title, but you may still have power in the sense that people rely on you and you're considered sort of a leader in the organization, and that might give you power, right?
Exactly. We typically define power as having control over other people. That's one aspect, and also over access to valued resources. And these resources include knowledge, and the network is also giving you some knowledge or access to knowledge. And like all other things like affection and money and food, it's a very broad concept. It's not only about one's rank.
Yeah, so it's a fascinating thing. So you have a couple of studies in this paper looking at how power enhances sort of behavioral performance, right? Do you want to talk about those studies?
Yes, I'm actually quite excited about them because they also tackle theoretical debate in the literature. So for quite a long time, one has assumed that power liberates people and makes them independent from others. And as a result, their behavior and the way they think is very disinhibited and automatic. So people, if they have power or feel powerful, they don't control their behavior. They don't have to. But my research is very inconsistent with them, with this kind of claims. So I showed actually that when people experience power, they control their cognition. They are really able to focus on what's important right now, and whatever is not important, what is called irrelevant, they can inhibit. They do not get influenced by that. So they have this better ability to focus. So this is like one study in which I showed this. And in the other study, I used neuroscience methods to go even deeper into the processes that underlie these effects. So I was able to show that when there's a conflict happening, so when you have a focal goal, but there's distracting information around, both people who feel powerful and people who feel powerless experience this kind of conflict. They both perceive that there is this conflicting or distracting information there. So they both process this. But those who experience power, they are able to use this information to then control their behavior, to really engage in behavior that is goal-focused. And those who feel powerless, they experience this conflict, but they are not really able to use this information to behave in a controlled or goal-oriented way.
Yeah, that's really fascinating. So the ability to focus and the ability to really resolve conflicts in more efficient fashion. You're saying those things come when you have power?
Exactly, yes. Yeah.
Yeah, go ahead.
People who experience power, they are able to resolve those goal conflicts. I also have done research in which I showed that they experience different goals as less conflicting, probably because they possess this ability to deal with these conflicts and solve them in a more efficient way.
Yeah, so it may have a lot of sort of policy implications too, right? So, there's a lot of talk about, this is not in the paper, but I just want to get your perspective. There's a lot of talk about guaranteed minimum wages and, things like that. And so let me ask you this, when you have resources, that is also sort of power, isn't it?
Yes, it's basically a part of the definition of power. If you have access to resources that you want and other people want, yes, then you have power.
Yeah. So what do you think society more generally, giving people more control, giving people at least a feeling of control could have a lot of beneficial effects, right, in their behavior?
Absolutely. So my research shows that you can basically induce this experience of power in all kinds of people, and many effects are positive, especially when it comes to goal pursuit. So people are really better to focus on their goals, to not get distracted, to perform well. So it has a lot of beneficial effects, and this is especially important in the organizational settings where performance is a major goal.
Yeah, so in organizational designs, Petra, I wrote a book in 2009, it's called Flexibility, in which I argued that probably prematurely that there will not be large companies in the future, and each individual essentially becomes a company and self-select. There won't be any hiring the way that we think about hiring. Individuals will self-select into a goal, and that would be the company, and they will dismantle that after the goal has been accomplished. Do you see things moving in that direction? Or we still have obviously conventional organizations all around the place, but do you see things moving in that direction?
I'm not sure if they move in this direction concretely, but they do move into the direction of less hierarchical organizations, so more like flatter hierarchies, where people can bring in their visions and also make contributions to important decision-making processes. This is definitely the case, and this is also a way to empower people and to benefit from the positive effects of this empowerment feelings.
Yeah, so a flat organization in some sense is a way to distribute power. And so, maybe there is some sort of an optimization from an organizational context you can think about.
Mm-hmm.
I wonder, right? So, do you have you done any research in that direction? How to sort of optimize organizational structures from this observation?
No, I haven't really looked into the structural level. I'm more doing research on the individual level. So basically how experiencing power changes an individual. The structural level, how it changes organizations, or how organizations can change to give people power or to make them more performing. These aspects I haven't really investigated in my own research.
Yeah. I want to go into another paper, a related paper, Power Effects on Implicit Prejudice and Stereotyping, the role of intergroup phase processing. You say power is thought to increase discrimination towards subordinate groups, yet its effect on different forms of implicit bias remains unclear. And so again, you have a couple of studies here. So what are you investigating here, and what did you find?
So here we distinguish between two different forms of implicit bias. One is called implicit prejudice, and these are kind of automatic associations with a group that are either positive or negative.
Yeah.
So you either like someone or dislike someone based on the group he or she belongs to. And the other form of implicit bias is implicit stereotyping. And this is more precise. You have a concrete association of a specific trait with a group. So very well-known stereotypes are that Blacks are athletic, or what else? Asian people are good at math. So these are very specific associations of a specific trait with a group of people. And we look at how power affects these two different types of implicit bias. And we found that when people are in this mindset of high power, they express more prejudice, and also they stereotype more. So it kind of seems that for them, like we focused on Black and white Americans. So African Americans, they associate with negative valence and with the stereotypes that they are athletic, and whites, they have like more implicit, like positive associations, and they associate them with the traits being smart. So this happens, and this happens on a very like unconscious level. But we then also here did a second study in which we looked at the neural processes that analyze these effects. It's actually quite complex, but also interesting. So we find that the underlying processes differ in these two type of implicit biases. So in the context of the evaluations, so positive or negative evaluations, we found that when experiencing high power, people process the African American faces greater than the white American faces. And we interpret this that in this context where you make evaluations, they perceive the African Americans as a threat to their own power. So in order to maintain their power and keep them down, they kind of focus on this African Americans, because these are important right now, because they do represent this threat. But in the context of stereotyping, where these associations are way more like a specific trait with a group, there we find the opposite. So people who experience high power focus more on in-group faces. And we interpret this that in this context, they have no interest in focusing on our group people. They don't have to, because they have a lot of power. They don't have to care about how other people are, what their interests are. So that's why they don't focus on the outgroup phases in this context.
Yeah, I was also wondering, Petra, that there has to be some sort of a risk management aspect to it from an evolutionary perspective, right? And so perhaps clan leaders, rewinding time 50,000, 100,000 years ago, did this very systematically. Perhaps from a risk management perspective, they had to keep their clan safe, and they had to essentially identify interlopers, let's say, so to speak, in a very efficient fashion. So I wondered, those attributes sort of gotten selected into the modern context.
Yeah, the reason why we have this implicit biases is actually because our brain is too busy and can so that it cannot process all information about all individuals. So that's why we tend to see people as part of a group, and then we attribute characteristics towards that group, to all people in that group. As you say, it kind of makes sense in some contexts. So normally the in-group we try to protect, and the out-group we often see as a threat. So here we have like these quick evaluations happening, and they happen like in milliseconds, like pace. So it's really, really fast.
Yeah.
So it's definitely something that has been happening a long time ago already, but we still have them. Just the form of these biases, the content of them changes a little bit over time.
Yeah, that's really interesting. So sort of a lower cognitive cost for the brain, maybe the first branch of that decision process, you have some sort of a classification going on. And that classification can be trivial in the modern context. Maybe use skin color, maybe use something else to put people into buckets. And that takes actually very little cognitive energy. And at that point, you can make decisions sort of at the group level, and that sort of optimize cognitive cost that way, right?
Exactly, that's basically the goal. And as I mentioned before, this often happens automatically, so you cannot. It's very hard to control it. It's super fast. It happens right away. So if you want to control your biases, you need to get an awareness that you're having these biases, and you have then to engage later control to try to inhibit those. But it happens really quickly. Like even people who would say, hey, I'm not a racist, they often have this implicit negative associations with outgroup people.
Yeah, I was thinking about that. So it appears to me, Petra, correct me if you don't think this way. It appears to me that this attribute is now incorporated into the hardware, or at the very least into the operating system. So everybody comes with this notion, and you can use software to dampen it. You can put apps on your hardware to sort of get better. But at the end of the day, the operating system and hardware have this innate deficiency, which seems to me that it's sort of difficult to dampen. You could smooth it out for a period of time. When the environment changes, it comes roaring back in some ways.
So there are ways to try to deal with these biases. So as I mentioned before, if you are aware of your biases and if you want to do something about it, what you typically can do is to really go into an interaction with already specific plans of not showing any bias. Or if you have, for example, if you're a recruiter and have job interviews with people from different backgrounds, in group and out group members. So you can structure the interview, make sure that you ask every person the exact same question, so that you are giving both people the same possibility to shine. So there are a couple of strategies But if you're not really trying hard to overcome your biases, you're gonna have show biased behavior. So you need to get aware of them, and then you have to think about what type of action in what specific moment can help you not act on your biases.
Yeah. You say here an indirect effect of power on implicit prejudice through enhanced processing of out-group versus in-group faces suggested a potential link between face processing and implicit bias. Now, face processing, in the larger sense, is a complex mechanism, but it seems to me that the modern human is using very few attributes to make that classification. For example, something like skin color. And so are they really processing the face?
Yeah, I mean, there are different aspects or face processing steps. In the paper that I did, I focused on the so-called N170 component of the event-related potential. This index shows basically more how you process the structure of the face, how the lips are aligned with the nose and the eyes, and basically the structure that makes you recognize that a specific picture is actually a face.
Yeah.
So it's not, in that study, I didn't focus on black and white. I excluded all color actually from the faces, but African Americans and white Americans also have a different face structure.
Yeah.
So in my paper, like all effects were found based on this face structure. But there are other papers that look at skin tone. They also find that the more typical one is for a specific category in terms of skin tone. So for example, the blacker someone is, the greater are the biases against these people. So there are really different aspects of face processing, and they all play a role together.
Yeah, I mean, the structure of the face makes a lot of sense. Again, from an evolutionary perspective, everybody had the same skin color, so that would have been a useless attribute from a classification perspective. And so we would have used structure of faces for clan identification, and we continue to do that. And this is something that in the modern context, we can tease out very easily, right? So we can just artificially change skin tone and see how people react to the picture. Has that been done?
Yeah, there has been a couple of studies doing exactly that. And as I said, it's like really these effects, like the far away it gets from your own skin tone, the greater your biases are. So there are a couple of effects here. There are also studies in the legal context. So studies investigating whether someone should get penalized for a specific behavior, and then it's also found that our group members and those who have very typical, like in blacker skin, those who are penalized even more than those that resemble yourself.
Yeah, so going back to the paper, you say that these findings demonstrate that power can affect implicit prejudice and stereotyping, as well as early processing of racial in-group and out-group faces. So, you know, there is, we talk a lot about the police force in the US lately. And when you are in a powerful position, what you're arguing is that these types of decision processes are natural, and so in some sense you have to be extra aware of them to be effective, right?
Yeah, that's true. So this process happen very fast. They happen automatically, so it needs special training to avoid them, to inhibit them. There's also quite some research in which they play computer games And in these computer games, you see black and white people carrying either guns or cell phones. And the task is basically to shoot when the person carries a gun, but to not shoot when the person carries the cell phone. So skin color shouldn't matter here. It's just about gun or cell phone, but you do actually find skin tone effects. So typically people, especially white participants, they tend to shoot black people more when they carry cell phones than white people, and they shoot less often when white people carry guns than when black people do. So there are these biases, and we absolutely need to get training to get rid of those. I also did a study in which I looked how power affects this kind of shooter bias that I just was talking about. It's not published yet because the facts were a bit weak, but we did find some hints that when experiencing power, this effect is even bigger. So you even have a stronger bias showing that you are more likely to shoot black people when they carry actually a cell phone and not a gun.
Yeah, so this is not in the paper, Petra. I just want to get your perspective. If we think of this as sort of a mental deficiency, let's say, do you think there could be some therapeutic interventions one could try?
Yeah, I think one should definitely work on them. So the first thing you should do is actually getting aware that you're having this bias. Yeah. So basically, you can then go into this kind of situation with the knowledge, like, hey, I have to be extra cautious. Here is an African American. He does not necessarily have to carry a gun. I might have this kind of associations in my head, but in reality, that might not be the case. Or he or she might not actually be criminal or aggressive. So awareness is the first step, and then you can train your biases with specific reaction time tasks. That's one step. Yeah. And we are still actually working on interventions. So I think there's still a long way to go. But really that awareness and willingness to control your biases, maybe just, take a step back before you act. These are the most important things to do.
Yeah. I want to go into another paper. You have power effects on instrumental learning, evidence from the brain and behavior. You say we investigated whether high power facilitates instrumental learning relative to low power, an effect that would support power effects on goal pursuit and decision making. What do you mean by instrumental learning?
This is about learning from feedback on your own behavior. So if you try something out, you don't really know whether it works or not, and you're getting either positive or negative feedback. And then you learn about the probabilities of choosing like something, and that's giving you a good outcome, or choosing something else and that's giving you a bad outcome.
Yeah. Okay. And so you have two studies here too. You want to talk about them briefly?
Yeah. So in these studies, I also manipulated people's experience of power, and their task was then to learn which choice option is the best. And there were like some probabilities behind these choice options. Some were just more likely to give you a good outcome than others. Yeah. And participants didn't know about these probabilities behind their choices, but their task was to learn it. And they had like several rounds, so they just start to choose, and then they get the feedback of like, yeah, this is correct, positive, smile, or this is incorrect, wrong choice. And slowly over time, they learn these probabilities, and they are more likely to choose the one that is correct, and to avoid the ones that are incorrect. And what I found is that people who experience power are better at learning both types of learning. So choosing the one that is correct, and avoiding the one that is incorrect. This is actually quite exciting also in the light of past research, because past research was always saying like the powerful just focus on the rewards, on everything that's good, because they are not in a threat situation. They don't have to worry about negative feedback or punishment and these kind of things. So the idea in the literature was always power leads to a focus on rewards, and low power leads to a focus on negative feedback and punishments. But that's absolutely not what I found here, because in the learning context, so the high power participants were really better at learning from both the positive feedback, and they chose then this positive options more often, and also learning from the negative feedback. So they also learned to avoid the bad choices more quickly. And also here I had a second study in which I wanted to investigate the neural processes that underlie these effects.
Yeah.
And here I distinguished between not only between positive and negative feedback, but also between so-called valid or invalid feedback. Valid feedback here was when you get a positive feedback when you choose an option that has a high probability of being correct. So let's say this option is correct for 80% of all cases, and you get a positive feedback here. That we call a valid feedback, because it reinforces the good option. And we call feedback invalid when it reinforces a bad choice. So for example, if you get a positive feedback on a choice that only has a 20% chance of being correct, so 20% is not good, it's below chance level. So here you get a positive feedback, but it's actually not really a good choice. So that we call invalid feedback. And what we found that people who experience high power, they were processing the valid feedback more deeply than the invalid feedback. So they basically kind of ignored the invalid feedback and focused on the feedback that really helped them learn which choice opportunities were the best ones for them.
Yeah, so thematically, this is somewhat related to the first paper we discussed, right? Distraction and focus. So it appears to me, Petra, let me know if I understand this. It seems to me that power gives you a level of focus, ability to manage distraction, and really make better decision-making processes that ends up with better outcomes. Is that the way to think about it?
Yeah, that's exactly it. So I found that in different contexts, here in the learning context, and the other paper more on this behavioral control context. I actually also found it in the context of public speaking, where the focus was more on emotional processing. So there we found that people experiencing high power, they were less worried about negative evaluations from others. So they were able to focus on the goal, not worry about what other people think. And because of that, they feel less anxious, less stressed, and they performed better. They gave a better quality speech. Yeah. So we really find this kind of effects in all kinds of context. So that's why I conclude that power really makes people pursue goals more effectively. So they are better at pursuing those goals. And in further research also showed that they actually are able to do that more efficiently, meaning that they are able to pursue their goals successfully with less cognitive investments even.
Yeah, so again, I see some policy implications here, Petra. So if you think of power as access to basic resources, and I'm thinking education in the US, most students get a significant amount of debt by the time they get out of school. And debt is in some ways reduces your power, right? Reduces your freedom. And it might have some negative implications for education and students in general. Do you think that way?
Yeah, that could be. As you mentioned, it decreases your resources, your financial resources. Education, of course, also increases your knowledge, and that's also a resource. So it has both sides. And I guess it's also a bit dependent on the person whether he or she is able to focus more on what he or she has gained and the resources he or she has, and then has this greater experience of power, or whether he or she really has to focus on the resources that are missing. So if this financial problems are really big, then it's really hard to experience your power, because this is really fundamental for you. You need to pay for your rent and your basic needs. So if that becomes really central in your life, then definitely you feel out of control, you feel powerless, and this can have a lot of negative impact. If you're sort of able to focus on what you've gained and where you do have control and where you do have resources, if you best can shift your mindset, this can help you to get a bit out of this negative circle.
Yeah, I mean, but what's fascinating, in the paper, as you say, power engaged more strategic processing of goal-relevant feedback. And so people at least perceiving power, and it could be resources, it could be freedom of decision-making, whatever the case may be, just in a better cognitive state from a learning perspective, it sounds to me.
Yes, exactly. So it's really about the way you feel. So like in this study, basically we had students, so they didn't really have any difference in how much resources they had or how much debts they have. They just came in my laboratory and I randomly assigned them to either high power or low power. So it's like basically anyone could be anyone, regarding of their background. It's really a random assignment. And I did find that those who were in this mindset of high power, they had this more strategic processing, which helped them to focus on their goals and to learn better.
Yeah, so we'll take a quick break, Petra. When we come back, we'll talk about some of your recent papers.
Okay, great.
Thank you.
This is a Scientific Sense podcast providing unscripted conversations with leading academics and researchers on a variety of topics. If you'd like to sponsor this podcast, please reach out to info@scientificsense.com.
So we are back. Petra, we were talking about power, how power affect cognitive control, stereotyping, learning, and so on. And it appears that it has a positive effect on all of these things. Obviously, stereotyping is not a good thing, but it seems to correlate with those aspects. You have another paper, Less Power, Greater Conflict, in which you say power facilitates goal pursuit, but how does power affect the way people respond to conflict between their multiple goals? And so we're looking at here situations where you have multiple goals, maybe a complex set of objectives you want to accomplish, and how power might affect that.
Yes, exactly. So before I was really investigating on how power makes people focus on their goals, and so they don't get distracted by anything. But then I was wondering, well, I mean, not everything is always a distraction. We may have multiple goals. So how does power affect people when they do pursue multiple goals? Do they also just focus on one goal? Do they don't care about the other one? Are they able to deal with this goal conflict? Do they actually experience goal conflict? So in this paper, the focus lied on this experience of goal conflict, because when we experience that our goals are in conflict with each other, so we cannot pursue one goal satisfactorily because of the other one, then we often feel stressed, and this makes us pursue our goals less well, and we also don't feel as good. So it has negative effects for our well-being. So here in this research, I gave people different goals, multiple goals, and I was interested to what extent they experienced this very same goals as being in conflict with one another. Because sometimes you may have different goals, but you don't necessarily see that they are in conflict with each other, so that you have to choose one and the other one wouldn't work. So maybe you can also perceive it feasible to pursue both goals. And I actually indeed found that people who experience high power, they experience that these goals that I gave them, they are not so much in conflict. While those experiencing low power, they had this great feeling of conflict between the goals. And then I was also wondering, what about their own personal goals? Do people who experience high power experience a lot of conflict in their own goals? And people who feel powerless. So also here I found that people who experience high power, they experience less conflict between their personal goals than people who experience powerlessness. And in the end, I wanted to see whether this has consequences for their planned behavior. So would they, if they experience a lot of conflict, would they just stop trying to pursue the goals at all because they're kind of stuck in that conflict? Or are they still able to make plans to pursue their goals? And what I found is that when people experienced low power, they really had this great experience of goal conflict, and this also prevented them to make plans on pursuing these goals. So this can be another reason why people who experience high power are better able to pursue their goals.
Yeah, that's really interesting. And I was just thinking that if less power is analogous to less resources, I would have thought, at least intuitively, that people with less resources have more experience managing multiple goals. But that's not the case. That's not what you're finding, right?
That's not what I find. No, I actually even have another paper which is connected to this one, where I gave my participants 2 different tasks that they had to solve at the same time. One was visual and one was auditory.
Yeah.
And the goal was just to perform as good as possible. I didn't say anything about focusing on one task or doing both tasks. The strategy was for them to choose. I just cared about the end result, which was a combination of the 2 tasks. And I found that participants who were in this high power condition, who experienced high power, they prioritized one task and did this task super well. And the other task they neglected a little bit, so they didn't perform so well on that. And participants who were in a low power condition, they tried to solve both tasks. They were okayish on both tasks. They weren't super good and not super bad. So the overall performance of high power, low power people on the 2 tasks together was the same, but the strategy was completely different. So the low power people, maybe that's kind of connecting with what you argued before. They did try to really deal with these both tasks at the same time.
Yeah.
Probably takes more resources. And the high power participants, they prioritize there. So they thought, well, the end result is important, so I'm just going to focus on one task and perform really well on this one, and I forget about the other task for the moment. So there's a difference in how they approach multiple goals, but it doesn't seem that low power people are better to deal with multiple goals, not at all. But you can also argue actually that high power people, when they are in high power positions, they really have to deal with a lot of different demands. They have a ton of different responsibilities. So they also have, they also are in this multitask surrounding as well. So the arguments, I guess, go both ways.
Yeah, I can see that. So there are two things. One is the complexity of the number of tasks that you have to do, and the other is sort of the luxury of being able to prioritize them. And so, if I understand this correctly, Petra, with power comes the luxury of prioritization that is not really afforded to people without power in some sense.
Exactly. I love the way you put it. That is exactly what I would say and what my research also suggests.
Yeah, it's very interesting. You have a couple of new papers. One of them is Power Reduces the Goal Gradient Effect. You say, how does the experience of power affect individuals' motivations to pursue goals at different stages of goal pursuit? You said you hypothesize that experience power affects individuals' motivation as a function of perceived goal proximity. And so you're looking at individuals at different points in that pursuit, and then looking at how power affects them.
Exactly. Here in this research, I focused on motivation mainly. I also had some performance indicators, but motivation was the main goal. And I was interested in how motivated people are to put effort into a goal when they just start pursuing that goal. So when the goal is still far away and they're just at the beginning of that goal pursuit, versus when they're already close to attaining the goal. Results were quite interesting, I think.
Yeah, they here they perform better when the goal was far versus near, while individuals experiencing low power showed an opposite trend. So again, it is some sort of endowment here, right? When with power you have more freedom, and you are less worried about when the outcomes are going to happen. Is that the way to think about it?
The way I think about it is that when people have high power, they start pursuing their goals right away when they see that there is a goal. So they really start and put a lot of effort in that. And then when they start getting closer to that goal and they see that they're on a good path, they don't waste their resources. So they stop investing a bit. They might even decrease their investment because they see they're going to attain the goal. So they try to really save resources. But they also start early, so to make sure that they actually are able to pursue that goal. People who experience low power, they're not so good with goals that are far away.
Yeah.
They live more in the here now because they do not have the resources to care about the future too much. Their focus is on what's happening right now. So a far goal for them is they kind of neglect it. They don't invest so much. They're not motivated. But when they have this feeling that they're now close to goal attainment, then they feel like, oh, now I really want to attain that goal. So I am motivated and I invest into it.
Yeah, you make another observation here. Findings suggest that high power does not always increase performance, as previously thought. You say it depends on how close people are to goal attainment. And so if I understand this correctly, Petra, low power, close proximity to the goal, they might perform well when the goal is in close proximity, but they don't do well when the goal is far. So it's not a performance question, right? It is really about when do they expect the outcomes.
Yeah, exactly. So when it's right before them, they really perform well. They also invest a lot. So they really need to see the prize in front of them. When it's far away, they disengage. They do not get started.
Yeah. I want to finish up with your latest paper, Psychological Power Alters Cognitive Efficiency. We talked a little bit about this. Power is known to promote cognitive processing in a goal-directed way. However, it is unknown whether powerful individuals invest more resources when pursuing their goals, whether they invest their resources more efficiently. So what do you find here? You're looking you're looking into the brain to see if you can make some hypotheses.
Yes, exactly. So here I was really interested if the powerful are so good at pursuing their goals because they invest a lot, or whether they can actually pursue their goals so well while still conserving resources. So that means that they are more efficient. So what I did is I had my participants do a working memory task. And while they were doing this working memory task, I measured their brain activity. And so in order to look at how efficient my participants were, I looked at how much neural resources they invest while performing that task.
Yeah.
So I first found that participants did not differ on the performance level. So my high power participants and my low power participants performed similarly. But the high power participant used less neural resources to actually come to the same result. So I concluded then that they are more efficiently, so they can achieve the same results by investing less effort.
That's really fascinating. So power reduces cognitive cost and allow the individual to become more cognitively efficient to reach goals. I was wondering, Petra, in an organizational context, I know that you do a lot of work there too. Have there been any studies that looked at, suppose you take an individual inside an organizational setting, let's say that individual had low power, and you make a switch to a high power situation. I wondered how long it takes for that individual to change, or does that individual change at all?
Yeah, that's interesting. So there are much less studies done in organization with such experimental settings, because you cannot just contact an organization and say, hey, I want to pick your employees and put them in high power positions right now, and you bosses, you don't have any power right now. They just won't do that. I don't know why. So there are less studies doing this. But in my research, I showed that these effects happen right away. So I just changed their mindsets.
Yeah.
And then the way they approach a task is completely changed. So I think my question is rather like, are these effects long term, or do they happen just when you get in this rush of feeling powerful because you just have been put in a high power position? What are the factors that basically change these effects? I don't know anything concretely for my research, but there's some research showing that it's very important whether you feel legitimate in your high power position. If you don't, then often you have reverse effects. So you behave like low power people. It also depends on whether you think your power is stable, or whether you have to worry that you could lose that power. If you have these worries that you can lose the power, the beneficial effects also often go away. Again, I haven't studied this on efficiency specifically, but I could imagine that these factors also play an important role here.
Yeah. Would it be correct in saying, Petra, if you look at all your studies and all the work that you have done in this area, the power effect is not systematic. It's not systematic. It's a constraint effect. Meaning, if you can remove the constraint, you basically switch over to another way of thinking, another way of looking at problems, another way to pursue goals, and so on. So, do you think power as sort of a constraint on the individual?
So, do you mean that the power
lack of power, I should say, less power, does that act as a constraint in their thought processes?
Yeah, I would say so. I do still think that we need to investigate low power much more now than high power, because we have quite a lot of theory and research on the effects of high power, much less on the effects of low power. So we do need to investigate more to make a lot of conclusions or better conclusions about them. But right now, I think that's what the pattern of research shows, that low power really hinders you in your cognitive processing, goal pursuit, and decision making.
Yeah, I don't know anything about this, Petra. I'm just thinking the other interesting thing would be what happens in sort of a discontinuous situation. So most of the experiments are more continuous. You have power, you don't have power, and you are in that regime, you're making decisions. What happens when there is a regime shift, that a powerful person suddenly finds himself or herself without power? Is there a difference there? Do they utilize their experiences from before in some way, or do they just switch over to the low power regime?
Yeah, this is a very interesting, exciting question. I would love to do research in this area. It's a bit more complicated because you need longer experiments. Yeah. Where you have to change people's power. I also think it matters whether they know that they could lose their power or not, because when people know that they can lose their power, their main motivation is normally to maintain their power. So they focus on that and less on, like, for example, leading a group well. They just focus on their own individual performance, and that can be to the detriment of the group. So we know things in this area a bit. But I, for example, would also wonder what is the difference of like just putting people in this low power position or having people actually losing power. So when they actually have experienced high power just before, but suddenly they have low power. It might not be the same when like comparing a person who has had no power for a longer time with a person who has just lost power. We don't really know much with regard to this at the moment, and I think there's really a need for more research here. It's super interesting, and it would also be closer to what we experience in real life.
Yeah. Excellent. Yeah, this is fascinating research, Petra. Thanks so much for spending time with me.
Well, thank you so much for having me.
Thank you.
This is a Scientific Sense podcast providing unscripted conversations with leading academics and researchers on a variety of topics. If you'd like to sponsor this podcast, please reach out to info@scientificsense.com.